You've always sensed something different about yourself, but you couldn't explain it without sounding dramatic or broken. You think deeply, feel intensely, or detach completely, and somewhere along the way, you learn to hide it. Maybe you've spent years wearing the right mask, saying the right things, yet still feel like you're watching life from behind glass. What if the problem isn't your sensitivity, your isolation, or your intensity, but that your psyche was never built for the surface-level world? Could it be that you're not dysfunctional, just wired for something most people never see? Let's look closer. There's a quiet ache that follows you through life, the sense that you're always slightly out of sync with everyone else. Not because you're failing socially. You can hold a conversation, play your role, show up in groups. But deep down, you know you're playing a part. You mirror what others expect. You learn the language of belonging, but it never feels like yours. You may have first felt this as a child. Maybe you were told you were too quiet, too intense, too sensitive, or too serious. So you adapted. You smiled more. You tried to be likable. You learned how to read the room, even if it meant ignoring your own inner voice. Carl Jung called this adaptation the persona, the social mask we create to function in the outer world. For most people, the persona is a tool. For people wired differently, it becomes a burden, a full-time identity that slowly disconnects them from themselves. You might not realize how much energy you've spent trying to be normal, how often you shape-shift depending on who you're with. In school, you may have felt like you were pretending to be interested in what everyone else found exciting. In adulthood, you might find small talk exhausting, not because you're rude or antisocial, but because it feels hollow. You crave substance, but the world seems addicted to surface. And so you start to wonder, is there something wrong with me? Why do I always feel like an observer, even in moments of connection? This isn't a social problem. It's a psychological structure. Jung believed that certain people have a dominant orientation toward their inner world. They're governed by introverted functions, which draw energy from reflection, depth, and meaning. These people aren't better or worse. They're simply operating from a different internal compass. But when they try to override that compass to meet external norms, they expend. Rien's fragmentation, a split between who they are and who they perform as. Here's the danger. The longer you suppress your authentic orientation, the harder it becomes to even remember what's real for you. You may wake up one day successful on paper, yet empty inside, because you've built a life around who you thought you had to be to belong. Ask yourself gently, when you're alone and no one's watching, do you feel more yourself or more lost? Fitting in is a basic human need, but for some, fitting in has always come at the cost of authenticity. This isn't something to pathologize. It's something to understand. What happens if you stop forcing yourself to match the world and instead begin the slow, honest work of building a life that matches you? You've probably heard it your whole life. You're too sensitive, you overthink everything, or you take things too personally. At some point, maybe you started believing that your emotional reactions were excessive. You tried to shut them down, stay calm, be rational. But the truth is, you weren't being irrational. You were feeling what others weren't ready to face. People wired like you often have a finely tuned inner radar. You sense the tone beneath the words. You notice subtle shifts in facial expressions, energy, even silence. It's not imagination, it's sensitivity, but not in the weak, fragile way the world tends to define it. It's a form of deep emotional intelligence, often rooted in what Jung called introverted feeling, a function that orients the person toward inner values, emotional coherence, and unspoken truths. The cost? You often feel like you're holding emotions that don't belong to you. You absorb others' moods. You feel tension in a room before anyone acknowledges it. You get emotionally exhausted in environments others find normal. And yet, most people don't see this, because, from the outside, you might appear calm, even stoic. The intensity is internal. This makes social life complicated. You want connection, real connection, but often end up overwhelmed, misunderstood, or quietly drained. You might find yourself retreating from people not because you don't care, but because you care too much, too often, with too little reciprocity. Think about it. How many times have you made yourself smaller just to maintain harmony? How often have you ignored what you were feeling just to protect someone else from discomfort? This isn't just personality. It's a survival strategy. Sensitive individuals, especially those who grew up in unpredictable or emotionally repressed environments, often become hyper-attuned to others' feelings as a way to stay safe. Over time, this sensitivity becomes a lens through which the entire world is experienced. But without boundaries, it can turn into quiet self-erasure. Jung warned about the risk of inflated feeling, where the individual unconsciously identifies with their emotional insights and loses balance. But he also saw sensitivity as a path to authenticity if it's directed inward first. Before you care for others' feelings, you have to reconnect with your own. You're not weak. You're wired to feel, and feeling in its healthiest form is a source of wisdom. But to access that wisdom, you need to stop apologizing for your depth. The goal isn't to be less sensitive. The goal is to become stronger in how you hold it. Let's explore how your mind works behind that sensitivity and why it rarely rests. There's a particular kind of mental exhaustion that's hard to describe. You're not just tired. You're full. Your brain doesn't stop. It analyzes, revisits, replays. Conversations from days ago keep surfacing. Minor moments loop in your head as if they're asking to be solved. You may find it hard to sleep, not because of stress, but because your mind simply won't let go. You might not realize it, but this pattern often reflects a dominant introverted intuition or introverted thinking function, both of which orient the mind inward toward complexity, pattern recognition, and meaning-making. Jung observed that people wired this way often carry a deep psychological drive to understand what others overlook. It's not curiosity, it's compulsion. Here's what it looks like in daily life. You walk away from a conversation and keep thinking, why did they say it that way? What did they actually mean? Did I respond the right way? Or you notice a contradiction in someone's behavior and your mind won't stop mapping the possible motivations behind it. You analyze your own reactions constantly, wondering if you're overreacting or ignoring something important. This isn't overthinking in the casual sense, it's a survival habit. When you're wired to search for underlying patterns, your mind naturally digs below the surface of everything. But when that search becomes chronic, it can start to distort your perception of reality. You don't just think about what happened. You create layered narratives, possibilities, outcomes. You exhaust yourself trying to solve people, situations, even yourself. What are you trying to resolve? And is it actually resolvable? Many people wired this way have early experiences of emotional uncertainty or inconsistent key feedback. In response, the mind becomes a private processing machine. It loops, not to create drama, but to create safety. It's trying to prepare, understand, or predict, because unpredictability once meant pain. Jung warned that when a function dominates the psyche without balance, it can become tyrannical. Introverted intuition, for instance, can spiral into paranoia or compulsive insight-seeking. The solution isn't to suppress this depth, it's to ground it. Try this. Instead of trying to solve every thought, observe it. Let it pass without judgment. Ask yourself, is this thought asking for action or just attention? That distinction alone can free up hours of emotional energy. Your mind loops because it's wired to make meaning, but sometimes The meaning isn't found through more thinking, it's found through pausing, through allowing uncertainty to exist without collapsing into it. Let's look at why most of the external world feels so misaligned, and what that reveals about your core psychological wiring. You try to follow the script, get the degree, show up for the job, maintain relationships, perform. In social settings, from the outside, it might look like everything is going fine. But inside, it's different. You feel like you're running on empty, like you're doing what's expected, but none of it feeds you. And when you pause long enough to notice, you're left with a question that's hard to admit out loud. Why does all of this feel so hollow? This is more than dissatisfaction. For many people wired differently, it's a clash between outer structure and inner truth. Jung believed that people with dominant introverted or intuitive functions, especially those on a path toward individuation, struggle with roles that don't reflect who they really are. These people can perform well in systems, but they slowly lose touch with their own vitality. You might notice this during long meetings where no one says what they really think, or in friendships where the conversation never goes deeper than logistics and surface-level events. You might dread small talk not because you're antisocial, but because your psyche is built for substance. And yet you may also feel guilty for this disinterest, wondering if you're ungrateful, lazy, or self-sabotaging. But here's the truth. The things that drain you are often the things that ignore your actual psychological needs. Let's look closer. If you're driven by introverted intuition, you likely need solitude, insight, and freedom to follow your inner vision. But conventional structures demand external focus, constant productivity, and interpersonal performance. That's not alignment. That's friction. And when that friction becomes chronic, you start to disconnect from your own inner compass. Jung warned about the danger of living according to the expectations of others rather than the truth of the self. He called this the risk of identification with the persona, when your outer role replaces your inner identity. So ask yourself quietly and honestly, which parts of your life give you energy, and which parts slowly take it away? The goal isn't to escape all responsibility or abandon structure. It's to begin building a life that matches how your mind and heart actually work. That begins with permission to stop pretending the standard script is enough. Let's turn now to the deeper mental habits that keep pulling you away from the present and into relentless internal questioning. You don't settle for the first answer. You want to know why things work the way they do, why people act the way they act, why systems are built this way, why your own reactions keep repeating. This drive doesn't come from skepticism. It comes from a need to understand what's beneath the surface. But over time, this can become exhausting. Nothing feels certain. Every truth feels conditional. And when others are content with, "That's just how it is," you can't help but ask, "But why? And what does that really mean?" Carl Jung saw this as a necessary part of the individuation process, the journey of becoming psychologically whole. To move toward authenticity, you must question the beliefs, roles, and values you inherited. But for rare minds, this questioning isn't a stage. It's a way of being. You live in ambiguity, constantly dissolving and rebuilding your worldview. In practice, this looks like distrust toward rigid ideologies, resistance to groupthink, a tendency to challenge tradition, not out of rebellion, but out of principle. It also creates inner conflict. You want clarity, but the moment you get it, your mind starts unraveling it again. You might notice this especially during transitions, leaving a job, ending a relationship, changing your lifestyle. While others move forward with certainty, you pause. You sit in the tension. You analyze every thread. Sometimes you get stuck there. Jung warned about this danger. When you live too much in your mind, disconnected from the body and emotion, your thinking function can dominate the psyche. What begins as a search for truth turns into chronic doubt, mental paralysis, or emotional numbness. You start thinking about life instead of living it. But questioning isn't the problem. It's a gift when grounded in reflection, not obsession. So ask yourself, what are you questioning and what are you voiding? Are you searching for meaning or are you afraid of what happens when you stop searching? There's a difference between doubt that leads you inward and doubt that pulls you away from yourself. Your task is not to find absolute answers. It's to learn to live with complexity and still move forward. Now let's look at how your emotional depth can turn into invisible labor and how much you carry without realizing it. You've probably been the one others rely on, the one who listens deeply, stays calm, understands before being asked. In your family, you may have been the emotional anchor, even as a child. In friendships, the one people open up to without hesitation. You may even find strangers confiding in you without knowing why. What you might not realize is that this isn't random. You've been trained, often unconsciously, to tune in to other people's emotions before your own. Carl Jung spoke about the psychic burden of over-identification with the helper archetype, when care becomes your entire identity. It's noble, but dangerous, because the more emotional labor you do for others, the less space you leave for yourself. In early life, if your environment was emotionally unpredictable, with anger, silence, guilt, or neglect, you may have developed a hyper-attuned emotional radar. You learn to anticipate the moods of others, to manage, soothe, or avoid them, not because you wanted to, but because you had to. Now, as an adult, this habit continues. You sense tension before it's spoken. You try to fix people's moods, sometimes without being asked. You take responsibility for how others feel, and shame when you can't make it better. You absorb what isn't yours. Then you wonder why you're exhausted, resentful, or quietly numb. Ask yourself this: do you know how you actually feel when no one else is demanding something from you? This is the cost of chronic emotional overfunctioning. You become so focused on maintaining relational harmony that you lose access to your own emotional truth. And over time, that self-abandonment creates symptoms: fatigue, irritability, guilt, and eventually, burnout. Jung believed that true healing involves confronting the shadow, the parts of ourselves we deny or neglect. For many emotionally responsible individuals, their own needs live in the shadow, repressed, minimized, or dismissed as selfish. But your needs aren't selfish, they're data, and the more you ignore them, the less authentic your support for others becomes. The work here is subtle but life-changing, learning to pause before helping, to ask, is this mine to hold, and if not, to let it go, even if no one else does. You were not designed to be a container for everyone else's emotions. You were designed to be whole. Let's talk now about your identity, and why the more you search for it, the less clear it becomes. You've probably spent a lot of time trying to figure out who you really are. You've read the books, taken the personality tests, asked the deep questions. You crave authenticity, not as a buzzword, but as a way of life. And yet, despite all that self-exploration, your sense of identity still feels fragile, vague, incomplete. You're not imagining that. People wired for deep self-awareness, often dominant in introverted or intuitive functions, live in a constant state of inner assessment. You question your motivations, you analyze your reactions, you explore your past, your traumas, your dreams. But the more you reflect, the more the self begins to blur instead of clarify. Jung warned that the self isn't something you find like a hidden object. It's something you build, Slowly, by integrating your contradictions, your persona, your shadow, your instincts, your higher ideals, all of it must be faced, felt, and reconciled. That process is called individuation, and it's not comfortable. The confusion you feel is often a necessary stage because you're not just figuring out who you are, you're unlearning who you were told to be, the roles you adopted, the expectations you inherited, the coping mechanisms you mistook for personality. Here's a real-world example. A woman in her late 20s who has always been the responsible one begins to feel restless, resentful, even angry. She can't explain it. Her life looks fine. But internally, she's outgrowing the identity she built to survive family dysfunction. Her mind keeps whispering, "This isn't you anymore." But she doesn't yet know what comes next. You may be in that same liminal space, where the old version of you doesn't fit, and the new version hasn't fully emerged. That space feels disorienting, but it's also essential. It means you're no longer living on autopilot. So ask yourself, who are you when you're not trying to be impressive? When you're not performing your role or managing others' expectations? The answer won't come all at once, but the search itself is a kind of rebirth, not into a perfect identity, but into a deeper integration of who you've always been. Next, let's talk about what happens when someone finally gets close to seeing the real you, and why, even when you crave connection, you sometimes push it away. You crave real connection, not just attention or companionship, but depth. You want to be understood, to be seen beneath the surface, to share the parts of yourself you rarely reveal. And yet, when someone finally gets close enough, you feel something unexpected: resistance. You pull back, you become distant, vague, or emotionally unavailable. Then comes the guilt, the confusion, the self-questioning. Why do I keep doing this? This isn't a flaw in your personality, it's a protective adaptation, often rooted in early relational experiences where vulnerability was either unsafe or unreciprocated. Jung described this dynamic as the tension between the self and the persona. When your social mask is too firmly constructed, when you've built an identity around being who others want you to be, real intimacy feels like exposure, like danger. You may not even realize you're doing it. You might over-explain, intellectualize, change the subject, or suddenly need more space. You may sabotage relationships that are going well, not because you don't care, but because a deeper part of you fears what might happen if someone truly sees you. This pattern can be subtle. You might form deep emotional bonds with people from a distance, through long messages, abstract conversations, or shared intellectual experiences, but struggle with physical closeness or emotional availability in real time. You feel safe in depth, but only when it's controlled. So ask yourself gently, when someone sees the real you, your uncertainty, your complexity, your need, do you feel closer to them or more exposed? People wired this way often carry a core wound around being too much or not enough. So they learn to manage relationships instead of experience them. They create closeness carefully, in doses they can control. But over time, this leads to a painful cycle: craving intimacy, creating distance, then blaming themselves for the disconnection. Jung would say that this is the psyche protecting itself from shadow, the parts of you haven't fully owned. Until you integrate those parts, the vulnerable child, the fearful adult, the shame, the hunger, connection will always feel dangerous. The work here isn't about forcing yourself to be open. It's about slowly reteaching your nervous system that emotional closeness doesn't have to equal collapse, that being seen doesn't always lead to rejection, that someone might meet the real you and choose to stay. Let's go deeper now, into the part of you that walks toward darkness, even when you could avoid it. While others seek distraction, you seek depth. You find yourself reading dark literature, analyzing existential questions, revisiting past pain, not out of obsession, but out of need. You want to understand, not escape. And even when it hurts, part of you feels more alive in the depths than you ever did on the surface. This can be confusing to others, and even to yourself. You might wonder, why do I always end up here? Why do I lean into discomfort while others avoid it? The answer, in Jungian terms, lies in your relationship with the shadow, the hidden, often painful parts of the psyche that most people repress. But you approach them. You're not afraid to ask hard questions. What am I hiding from? What did my childhood teach me about safety and love? What parts of me were never allowed to exist? You don't want easy answers. You want truth, even if it unsettles you. But this depth has a cost. It can isolate you. Others might label you as intense, dramatic, or negative, when in reality, you're just unwilling to numb yourself. You've seen what happens when pain is ignored, and you've chosen a different path, one that doesn't avoid suffering, but transforms through it. Still, depth without containment becomes dangerous. You might find yourself cycling through emotional intensity without integration, feeling everything but struggling to move forward. That's when shadow work turns into shadow dwelling. Jung emphasized that the shadow is not to be eradicated, but related to. When you engage your darkness with respect, not indulgence, it becomes a source of vitality. You begin to access the parts of yourself that were once exiled, your grief, your anger, your hunger for meaning. Ask yourself this: when was the last time you allowed yourself to fully feel what you carry, without intellectualizing, avoiding, or numbing it? You are not addicted to pain. You are oriented toward truth, and the truth lives in the depths. The task is not to avoid those places, but to return with something real: wisdom, self, knowledge, compassion, not just for others, but finally for yourself. Next, let's bring all of this together and look at what it really means to stop searching for identity and begin the slow, honest journey of becoming whole. You may still feel confused, fragmented, torn between what the world expects and what your inner voice keeps whispering. You may not have the clarity you were hoping for, but somehow you know you're not in the same place you were before. Something is shifting, not finished, not resolved, but quietly, undeniably different. Carl Jung called this lifelong process individuation, the gradual, often painful unfolding of the self. Not the self you show the world, not the one shaped by fear or performance, but the self that has been quietly forming beneath it all. The process isn't linear. There's no final stage, no perfect version of you waiting on the other side. Individuation is not about becoming someone new, it's about becoming someone real. This is where many rare minds get stuck. They think feeling lost means something's gone wrong. But being lost is often the first sign you've stopped living by a script. The emptiness you feel isn't failure. It's space. Space that used to be filled by roles, identities, and beliefs that no longer fit. Ask yourself honestly, what if you're not meant to arrive at a fixed identity? What if your task is to live as a question, and to grow into the kind of person who can hold that question without collapsing? Individuation requires inner conflict. It demands the confrontation of your shadow, your fears, projections, traumas, contradictions. It asks you to take back the parts of yourself you once abandoned, the parts that were shamed, denied, or deemed unacceptable. And as you do, something else emerges, a quiet inner authority, a sense that even when you don't know where you're going, you trust the one who's walking. This isn't about self-improvement. It's about self-integration. You don't need to become better. You need to become whole. That means holding the sensitive parts, the withdrawn parts, the restless, analytical, questioning, intuitive, and tired parts, not as problems to fix, but as parts of a complex living soul. You're not broken. You're not too much. You're not behind. You're simply built for something deeper, and you're finally starting to hear it. So take a breath. You're not lost. You're becoming. And that is the rarest journey of all,